So let me invite the next panel, the first panel of the day.
Mike, but
It's going to be moderated by Alin. Alin, please come on stage. Alin Iacob, guys. He's from the European Commission. It's worth an applause. Please, yes. The best is to come this way, Alin. Otherwise, you're going to start playing piano. You okay? You come this way. Okay. So, Alin, on your panel, you have Ionut from National Bank of Romania. Ionut is with us. Ralf from the European Association of TPPs, Arturo directly from Spain, and Panagiotis, my friend, head of development at Unzer. Guys, the first panel of the day. You have, Alin, 35 minutes. Can you make it? We have 40 minutes to win. Okay? Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I'm very much honored to be here. Every time, for me as a consumer representative, because I'm not representing the European Commission, just to be clear here, I'm chairing an expert group at the European Commission representing consumers. I'm a member of a payment systems market expert group at the European Commission representing financial services users. I'm also a member of the EBA banking stakeholder group at the European Banking Authority representing consumers and users. So, but I'm not representing Commission, I'm not representing the EBA here, just to be clear. So, so easy for me as a moderator to come after the very interesting presentations delivered before by David, of course, about the future of AI, and by Ernest's presentation, who made a lot of introductory remarks on what we will discuss today. Because the title of our panel is the status of regulatory landscape in Europe. We will focus more on PSD3, PSR, DORA, and FIDA, but together with the representatives of the representative of the central bank, the Romanian central bank, with Ionut Horatau, we will also touch a bit on instant payments regulation and what it is especially happening in Romania. So, to begin, to go directly in, I would like to ask Ionut, first of all, what are the most important points on the next pieces of financial regulation, those who entered into force, which is the case with the instant payment regulation, even if for the new non-Euro countries it will not be applied yet. But let's begin from the instant payment regulation, and let's try to go after the PSD3 PSR. I also have some questions about DORA, because DORA is coming so fast in. Mid-January next year it will be applied. Let's talk first of all about DORA then. Do you think that the Romanian players are prepared for this important piece of regulation?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Ionut from the National Bank of Romania. I'm happy to be here with all my co-panelists, and thank you so much, Alin, for a brief introduction. I have to admit that I have put some lines before the meeting in papers, but I forgot them home, so feel free to ask, to jump to the questions. I won't present the whole picture of the legal framework because it's quite complex. All of you, or many of you, know what are the challenges and what are the opportunities and what are the pieces of legislation that are in preparation. I'm very impressed by the first touch of presentation by David that present the practical view and the interlinkage between different pieces of legislations. In a nutshell, to be very brief on that, indeed we have PSD3 that will came into force in a timeline of at least 2 to 3 years. We expect to be the next year to have also the payment service regulation, that is the package. We have a directive that will be afterwards transposed into national legislation of different member states and also have a piece of legislation that is directly applicable, as we discussed, and is well known that the regulation, but will also have a period afterwards since the date of publication that will be applicable.
Could we touch the most important coming, let's say, news coming from the new regulation? Because as a consumer representative, I'm the most interested on fraud, because fraud is very much affecting consumers. Unfortunately, even with the strong customer authentication, there are still fraudsters, very efficient.
This is the most touchy points that the strong customer application will be some changes in order to have what will be the business case or the situation where the strong customer authentication will not be enough anymore, for example, for a payment service providers to prove that there was some authorized transaction in respect of payment service users. We well know that we have some reports even published this year by the ECB and also by the European Banking Authority that put the finger on the side that most of the burden of losses was supported by the payment service users that you also represent successfully in the European institutions. And that is also the regulator try to shift between the burden that is now under the payment service users to the payment service providers, but of course creating a balance, because it is not the case if the payment service users act fraudulently or with gross negligence. And we have some clearance here and clarifying more legal text on what means gross negligence and what are the cases where a transaction should be considered authorized versus unauthorized. And to be very swift on that, I don't want to be very technical on this, but to touch the practical points. For example, an unauthorized transaction would be considered in the case of manipulation of the payment service users to have an authorized transaction. Even the transaction is authenticated, for example, this is the exactly word that will be used, that not means the transaction is actually authorized. Or even the third parties steal or some way, in a fraudulent way, take the credential and authorize afterward the payments. It is also an unauthorized transaction. And the burden of, in these cases, will be supported by the PSP, because have all the instruments and the power is in the driving seat to have the, and also from the competent authority, this is the incentives for payment service providers to develop more the security measures, to have preventive measures before the fraud happen, because afterwards it's difficult, as you well know.
I'm very happy hearing you, Ionut, on this point. Of course, we know the Commission proposal, we know the European Parliament approach, which is very pro-consumer. Let's see the Council, which is still under a very heavy debate, both pieces of regulation out there. So, going further a bit to Ralf. Ralf, you are a very active member of the PSMAG. We are so good colleagues there, every time admiring your points of view and your interventions, representing third-party providers, which are the newcomers into the payments landscape. What are for you the most important points you want to raise, the opportunities, the challenges you see in those new pieces of regulation, and which are the most important challenges first and then opportunities you are seeing?
Okay, well, also from my side, thanks for having me. It's an honor. Right, let me start with instant payments, because we've been pushing for years, because banks have been basically dragging their feet on that. It's been sort of available in live for many, many years, but only sort of half of the banks actually used it. And from our perspective, it was one of the main shortcomings of PSD2 to actually get more payment certainty. So after you initiate a payment, because remember, we're only initiating, we're not executing the payment. So from our perspective, we have to get some certainty about the actual execution. And because that was lacking, or not feedback coming from banks, we were pushing on instant payments being mandated so that we get that certainty as basically intrinsically to the transaction. So that's something we're really looking forward to. We would have loved to have sending first and receiving, because that's more important from our perspective. But nevertheless, it's coming, and so we're very glad about that. And next one, of course, from our perspective is PSR, PSD3, or mainly PSR. We had a long, long list, whatever, 30-something or so of improvements that we wanted from the Commission on PSD3 or PSR. And they put up like maybe 5 or so in the original proposal. So we had still a list of 25 left, which we have been lobbying for. But unfortunately, with not much luck in the Parliament, thanks to the Polish rapporteur, and also with even less luck in the Council. So we are facing a very significant challenge, so much so that we are now actually more or less gave up on the 20 whatever something things that we think should be added, and we are now got to focus on like 3 proposals the Council is making, which could easily kill TPPs in Europe. So that's not good at all, and we are, well, trying our very best to get that channeled in a better direction. And then, of course, Open Finance, FIDA. Actually, similar picture. Well, there, the Parliament's view, I think, was good. The proposal by the Commission also, although, and going with the theme here, and was mentioned earlier, I think being more human or customer-centric, we believe that the data access for the customer, that would have been the main thing. And how the stakeholders interact and how that should be done, I think, can be left to the market. We have shown with SPA, maybe let Arturo talk about SPA there, that this is possible and does not need to be regulated.
So thank you very much, Ralf. Arturo, could you go on, because you are representing the Spanish Association of Fintechs, and I'm remembering those times when we as consumers and users representatives were so favorable to see some other players coming in. Of course, there are every time risks that consumers are facing, but fintechs came in with fresh air, and it was an important improvement. What could you tell us about challenges, opportunities in those 3, in fact, most important acts coming, PSD3, PSR, and FIDA?
Well, I'm going to pick up on a point from David Bird's presentation. So when he mentioned fintech as one of the milestones in the evolution of banking, back in 2016, actually 2016 was the year that the Spanish Fintech Association was incorporated. And at the time, it was perceived that this would be a winner-takes-it-all battle. So it would either be the fintechs throwing away the incumbents, or the other way around. Actually, I was in a very interesting panel debate in Spain where a CIO of Banco Santander was discussing with some fintechs, and it was depicted as the Lord of the Rings. So it was just a matter of time that that mortar will fall to the orcs, which were at fintechs. So I think to a large extent, fintechs have made incumbents significantly better, but at the expense of their own survival, particularly in the B2C space. So the number of successful B2C fintechs in Europe, I mean, I think I have more than enough fingers in one hand to name them. And the most prominent one, which was also mentioned earlier this morning, has gone public in the US, which I think it's a massive failure for Europe. This is Klarna. Klarna announced last week that they're going public in the US stock exchange. So we have to think what we have done wrong for this to happen. So I don't think this was ever a winner-takes-it-all battle, but I would have expected back in 2016 that by now a number of incumbent banks would no longer be there, and that some prominent fintechs would have taken their place. And that this hasn't happened. And it's just not because fintechs were not good enough. It was because legislation stopped them from doing it. And I'm going to give PSD2 as an example, so I was the founder of Eurobits, the first account information service provider in Europe, and this was back in 2003, so a long time ago, and we were, after a long journey through the desert, we were quite successful, and when PSD2 came into force, our numbers dropped by 25%. Getting new customers was 25% more expensive, and I was lucky or wise enough, or a combination of the two, to sell the company to Tink, which was subsequently bought by Visa, because otherwise we would not be running anymore. So PSD2, which was aimed at making the payment services space more competitive and innovative, actually killed innovation. Many people were even saying that PSD2 was going to be like a reset button, putting the innovators at the same starting line as the new players, trying to leveraging the existence of a new regulation. And that's really bad. It sends a really dangerous message to innovation in Europe. So if you dare to innovate, your innovation is going to be killed by legislation. So I think we have to rethink how we approach this, and probably it's more, we've been discussing this at EDPP for a long time, so more principle-based, outcome-oriented legislation rather than prescriptive legislation, which has, on top of being prescriptive, has a very bad thing in addition, which is very ambiguous. So there isn't anything worse than prescriptive combined with ambiguous.
I understand your point, even if as a consumer representative, I ask every time for, at least for legislation, for regulation, to have it, because unfortunately, even if we have quite good legislation today in Europe, the enforcement is not so well performed, so consumers in the EU are still suffering for a lot of fraud, for a lot of things happening. Do you think that PSD3 will come with a good outcome for yours?
No. I think PSD3, well, more PSR than PSD3 is probably going to be worse.
Oh, even worse.
It's more prescriptive, and it takes away some fundamental rights, both from consumers and from TPPs. So, and we've mentioned DORA. So, to me, it's astonishing that PSR is going to prohibit some obligations that DORA is going to impose on TPPs. So you're not going to be able to have any sort of contingency. That's going to be, at least at the present time, the way the draft is, it's going to prohibit contingency measures for TPPs. So, and at the same time, you have to be redundant on everything except on your core service. So this is ridiculous, and this essentially is taking away a fundamental right from the consumers, which is their ability to access their own information at their own time and the way they find it most convenient. So at present, it looks PSD3/PSR is only going to make things worse for TPPs.
I really think that we should continue this discussion. Also, the EU for us. Nothing is for forever. If we can find ways to do a better job, we will be every time happy to contribute, because I really think that stakeholders in the EU could do it better than it was done before. Last but not least, Panagiotis Kriaris is the head of business development at Unzer and a very active member of LinkedIn, also publishing a lot of interesting things there. So Panagiotis, coming to the debate, what are the main challenges, the most important opportunities you are seeing from the new legislation which is coming now?
So, thank you. So I'd like to take a step back, because we are discussing about legislation. So for me, it's quite interesting. We are discussing about Europe, about legislation, how this is influencing financial services. And for example, it has always been the case that Europe is very regulatory heavy, but the US is taking a different approach. And if you look at what's happening in the US today, they're also introducing open banking via regulation. If you would tell this to somebody a few years ago, they would say, okay, it's probably not going to happen. So I think it's interesting to put this in other perspective. So that's one piece for the discussion. Now, the second thing is that because we are discussing about all these things happening, and I think there is lots of overlapping in terms of the initiatives. For me, if I would have to summarize the main things that are influencing from a regulatory point of view, what's happening today in Europe. So one is the PSD3 and the PSR. I think for the PSD3 and the PSR, we have to stress the fact that the PSR is the one. So PSR is a regulation, meaning that it doesn't have to be transposed into national, so it doesn't need additional local regulation, right? So I think that's important to stress. And PSR is mostly going to have open banking under its umbrella, so meaning that there is a harmonization effort to be had in this direction. So that's one piece. Then we have FIDA, as you mentioned, and FIDA is for me, FIDA is the Open Finance Initiative of Europe, right? And it's much more important for the next step, at least more important than people think, than PSD3. I mean, they go hand in hand, but FIDA is actually introducing, for example, we were always complaining that PSD2 doesn't give any incentives to the banks. So FIDA is now allowing incentives to the banks. They're actually allowing remuneration for banks they have this data holder and the data issuer thing, so the banks are going to be able with some restrictions, so that's the second one. Then you have the SEPA account access, which is basically building on enabling, I would say, open banking to compete with the schemes, for example, and that's a long discussion to be had. And then you have other stuff like the Instant Payments Initiative, which is very, very important, the regulation. And then, of course, you also have the digital wallets, the European digital wallet, which is coming. It's not focused on financial services, but it's going to be influencing a lot.
Thank you very much, Panagiotis. I must confess that as a consumer representative, even if I'm a speaker, I'm every time placed at the end of the day, at the bottom of the list. For me, today is a very big honor to open the panels. And I understood why is this today, because I have seen the title from a tech-centric to a human-centric approach. So, humans, consumers, being much more considered in the future. Do you think, could you, every one of you, mention which is, in your opinion, the most important point from the new coming legislation and regulation which will favorably affect consumers, which will provide consumers, which will empower consumers with something important? Let's begin with Ionut.
Thank you very much. I will be on
you've mentioned before some
more
points,
positive approach, and I am sure that the PSD3 and the new piece of legislation will bring something more, even in terms of opportunities for TPPs especially. We know that this is a very dense piece of legislation, PSD3, PSR, even DORA, what are the applications, what are the preparements for the envisaged entities, and also for FIDA, financial data access. As I'm again back to the first presentation of David, that marked something very important, that those AI tools will come from the consumers or payment service users perspective, and we have to, this is a great opportunity to have all the data in place in terms of, of course, this should be achieved through digitalization, but we cannot open the gate without having a gatekeeper. We know the burden of the legislation. We know that we should be all prepared, but eventually, as Ernest said, digitalization evolves, innovation evolves. There are great opportunities here for third-party providers, for payment service providers, and so also for payment service users. But eventually, as Ernest said and underlined in the last presentation, we need to be in the partnership. We need to understand, of course, the need for the TPPs, the need for the PSPs, and also the need for the payment service users. And also the regulator at the EU level, whatever it would be, European Commission, Council, or different banking, European Banking Authority, whatever, they are trying to do the best approach in order to outcome and to tackle the risks, because eventually it's not quite right, as already mentioned, the ECB and the EBA report, that over 80% in the first half of the 2023 the burden of losses were supported by the consumers, and this is what we try to tackle. We cannot be, closed-minded and closed. We want to open doors, but we also want to tackle the risks and to have a balance between benefits and risks and tackle those measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ionut. I think that this kind of events, this very important event today could be an opening for continuing discussions of finding what the consumers want. Consumers want are the balanced approach. We don't want to be favorized, but we don't burn all the fraud. So, Ralf, could you put your consumer hat a bit and try to identify something important for humans, for consumers, for people?
Yeah, I think I alluded to already, we are talking far too much about the interaction between within the ecosystem, between the stakeholders like the data holders, the data brokers, TPPs, banks, insurances, etc., and how they should or should not interact, how they should share schemes, etc. All of this would not need regulation, which we have shown, which was proven with SPA. That can be achieved by just market forces, because we are coming together voluntarily to agree such schemes. It does not need a regulation. What is needed by regulation is the consumer access. It is basically making a PSR and PSD3, or basically forcing the banks in this case, or payment institutions, the payment providers, ASPSPs, as we call them, to provide better customer interaction. And most of that is in the user interfaces. So everyone talks about APIs, but what really matters is the user interface. And we heard it earlier, because also AI will use the user interface. It'll help the customer to use the user interface. That's where we will have, the AR and VR and all of that. So we're actually trying to focus. We're focusing on something which is not important for customers at the end. And same thing with FIDA said as well. The only thing we need about open finance is that those who do not yet have a 24/7 access for their customers getting hold of their data, those should be forced to provide a 24/7 user interface. And once that is available, then everything else will fall in place. And so again, it is very important to have these user interfaces come to existence where they are not, and be much improved going forward. And maybe you already mentioned SCA. One other good example. So we have completely unnecessary restrictions on this SCA, so it could be made much user-friendlier, which hopefully will come, but as it stands in the current negotiations, we're probably losing that battle again. So in the UK, they're going a different way, and maybe the better way of making it more outcome-driven, less prescriptive on how things should be done, but what should be achieved. That's really what matters.
Thank you. Arturo,
yeah,
same
I'm
question.
going to go more or less in the same direction, but first let me add to something that I mentioned before. So if you do a piece of legislation, be a directive or a regulation, and then you need to do a technical standard, then that means that your regulation has failed to be clear enough. If you then need to do guidelines and opinions, then that means that you didn't even do the technical standard well. And then you have Q&As to clarify the opinion and the guideline. That means it's a failure of a failure of a failure of a failure. So that for starters. And the ultimate prejudice is on the customer. But then I think legislation, so as a starting point, PSD2 and PSD3/PSR should start by putting the customer rights and the objective towards the customer rights and obligations on top. So the aim of this legislation is to give, in the case of, say, open banking, and it would be the same for FIDA. The objective of this piece of legislation is to give customers secure access to their own data on a 24/7 basis, period. So that should be and that's not in the legislation. So it's just about technicalities on what you need to do to be a TPP, how the interaction between the TPP and the ASPSPs, and so that, to me, that's just a complete waste of time. So that customer first, and then you should leave the room open to business models, because if something lies on the compliance budget of a bank, it's never going to work well. So you need to craft the legislation in a way so that ultimately what you're legislating lies on a business budget on the bank. Then it's going to work, because somebody is thinking about making money thanks to the legislation, not on spending as little money as possible to comply with the legislation. And then ultimately that leaves room to things like SPA that was mentioned before, which I co-chair, and Ralf is the EDPPA representative in the initiative. But PAS should have been born a different way. So it was born because it was expected that PSD2 would fail, as it has, and it should be born from scratch because you're leaving room for the business. So let's get our act together. Let's have the TPPs and the ASPSPs speak how we can make a business of this, and not how to spend the minimum amount of money on compliance.
Thank you, Arturo. Panos, could you?
So, around the consumer,
yeah.
I think, for me, navigating through all this stuff is extremely difficult, even for people in the industry. So understanding what really is going to be the difference to the consumer, I think is really hard. But if I had to pick some of the things, I mean, I agree, not everything is perfect. But for example, if you look at the instant payments nowadays, so instant payments are becoming compulsory. And one of the provisions says that you are not going to be able to charge more for an instant payment than for a regular SEPA credit transfer, right? So I think that's going to be something that the consumer is going to see. So I mean, today we have costs in countries. So for one transfer, it can be the case. I mean, it can vary between €1 and I've seen 12 euros in some countries. So that's going to be a difference. I think the provision that you have in FIDA and and PSD3, there is the intention to give the consumers control over the data. Now, how this is going to actually look like, and the implementation always matters. But for me, I think conceptually the direction is correct. But again, we need to see how it's going to be the added value. That's the second one. And I think one of the pieces of legislation that is going to impact the consumers has to do with the digital wallet. Because right now you have some pilots in many countries, and especially banks are going to be obliged to use the authentication provided by the digital wallet. So it doesn't mean that they're not going to continue using their apps, but they're going to have to change the way that they authenticate the customers, for example. So these are things that are going to that will reach consumers one way or the other. And then we need to see, but I mean, for me, I agree that it's not, again, it's not easy to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, but if you look here and there, I think I'm sure you're going to find some pieces that are going to be impacting the consumers, and there's a question mark how much this is going to be the case.
Thank you so much. All of you provided your point of view. As our panel is coming to an end, to be the first ones to respect the schedule, and I hope the organizers will appreciate this. I will just mention that just coming from Brussels, and I can confirm that the new Commission will be much more focused on enforcement of the existing legislation, trying to solve those overlaps. We've just discussed it with DG FISMA and DG Just last week in Brussels. And not to provide two new pieces of legislation, just to try to find out. Maybe most of you have written the Letta report, which was issued first, then the Draghi report, and the very important issue of competitiveness of the European economy, of the EU economy, comparing with the United States one, with the Chinese one, and we should take into account everything being made without affecting consumers, without endangering the consumer protection rules, because consumers should be in the center, and I'm very happy that I participated into an event, and I was a moderator of a panel which put the consumer in the center. This is what we are asking for at the EU level, and we are fighting a lot. Thank you, Ionut, for being here. Thank you, Ralf, Arturo, Panos. One last statement from 30 seconds from everybody of you.
If I may also start, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I want to end this discussion in a positive way. We are very positive that PSD3 and all the pieces of legislation will come forward, will bring some more clarity on what we have existing in PSD2 and other pieces of legislation and link it. And I also want to thank the members of the TPP that are here present in this esteemed audience, and we want to thank them for if they weren't in the market as TPPs, I'm sure that the ASPSPs will know that will not came to the day that they are for being openness, and also I think they are grateful that the regulation exists to force them or to make them to be open as in for digitalization, for innovation. And second, to end this, this is the continued effort of the National Bank of Romania and also the competent authorities to support digitalization and fintech, and we are in close contact with the Romanian, and we have our champions here, and we want to thank them for all the effort. Thank you.
Great, Ralf.
Yeah, I just want to maybe say that between banks and TPPs, we have one thing really in common. Well, two things. One is finding win-win solutions, and the other one is what Dave Birch mentioned earlier, that our customers will become hyper-intelligent very soon with the help of bots. And that's not just a big challenge for banks, that's an equally big challenge for TPPs too. We will have customers using bots and whatever. They will not need a service provider. They can have software, which is, by the way, not regulated under PSD2, will not be restricted under PSD2 or any other regulation. It is not restricted to APIs that don't work. It has much more liberty. It is possibly more intelligent. So big challenges ahead that we both share. And I hope we can collaborate on that challenge.
Great point. Arturo,
I'm going to materialize that into a concrete action or hope. There's currently, to my knowledge, only one initiative in Europe that can make that happen, which is SPA. SPA is there. It already has some participants from one side. We're missing participants from the other side. So my hope for 2025 is that we'll have some asset holders on SPA, and we will start making transactions flow in one direction and the other.
Great. Panos, last word?
Very briefly, different point. I mean, regulation. Why are we having all this kind of regulation? I think looking back at the scenes, it's important to understand that payments is a critical infrastructure. So Europe is trying to build their own. We have long been dependent on US rails. Now we are trying to build a car. We have the rails. So I think that's where we should be aiming at in terms of adding value.
Thank you very much, Panos, Arturo, Ralf, Ionut.
Thank you, Alin. Thank you to you. Great moderation, guys.
Thank you.
Warm applause for our panelists. Thank you, guys. Thank you.